Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Speaking Bones, chapters 36 through 39. Winter worm, summer grass, the fruits of knowledge, thirst, a rebellion that isn't a rebellion, and madness. I'm so sorry, guys. I was not great with reading those off. In these chapters, I'm finally getting to see the fruits of Gia's labor. And I don't feel as bad about it as I expected to. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. You guys know how much I was dreading and yet interested. It was a real sort of like car crash scenario. Seeing the way that Gia's engineered berries shook out. And I think that maybe, and I'm not proud of this, but I think that maybe the fact that the whole reaction to the loss of the berry supply started with us seeing Tifan Huto really took the edge off of it for me, because he sucks so bad. He was just such a bad person in every sense, like completely lacking in any sort of self-awareness that would inspire him to be a better person. He used people, he abused people, he threatened and hurt people. I really despised him so much that things starting off with him almost made it feel like, well, you kind of get what you get, don't you? And I realized that also seeing the horrors that have really started to escalate so badly over the past, I don't know what you would say, 2 years? It's really difficult for me with the timing in these, as you know, with the Lyucu, and the fact that the people who were taking most of these berries tended to be the people that Kutan Rovo was assigning important jobs to and who were in her favor because they were particularly horrible. I suddenly felt a little bit more like, well, maybe this is fine, actually, which I know is fucked up and not ethical. And also there's a description about infants that are born with this craving because they were pregnant while they were using, So that is certainly a complete innocent who should not be caught up in this. But overall, I was so worried about how this was going to feel once I got here. And I have to admit to being pleasantly surprised that it wasn't as horrific to read in the sense that I was expecting. I thought reading it was going to feel the same way that reading about Kutan Rovo torturing that infant, dunking its head in the bucket of water. That chapter was so awful in so many different directions that it really caught me off guard. I wasn't prepared for how bad things got with her and how quickly it happened. So I think I was waiting for more like that. And instead, it feels a lot more like comeuppance in a way that I genuinely wasn't really expecting. So I'm going to back up here, obviously, but I just wanted to start off with my overall impressions. So we start off with chapter 36, Winter Worm, Summer Grass. And we are at the Temple of Still and Flowing Water, I think is the name of it. It's such a long name, I always forget. But this is where Thasseteki, aka Kinri, is holed up. And I say holed up, I was prepared for him to stay here for a while, although I thought it seemed like unlikely it would work out for him long term. I could understand him wanting to stay. So when we had that moment of him being like, no, this is where I'm going to be. I think like 2 sections ago was a moment of me going like, oh, does he just plan to live out the rest of his days here? Really? I was a little bit startled, but I could also see after the things that he had been through, maybe it felt like the only option, But by the end of this chapter, things have gone in a very different direction. So he's using his writing zither, and a lot of the like older people who are very proud of their handwriting, they have no interest in using it. There are a lot of younger ones who are really pleased with how like perfect the logograms come out. Old original manuscripts could be left alone to decay in peace, like ancient ruins silently bearing witness to another age, while new manuscripts gathered the fragments and collected the competing versions into a single comprehensive volume. And upon becoming a novice and taking up a temple name, every nun or monk took the following vow: I leave behind the world of strife and pain so that I can help mend it. Though I do not avert my face from the suffering, I will not add to it. And I really liked that vow, the balancing of it, like I am going to hold myself apart so that I do not contribute, but it's not the same thing as burying my head in the sand and pretending those pains and torments don't exist. Some of the monks and nuns departed the temple to tend to wounded veterans returning after defeat, and brought back rumors the emperor had gone missing after the war, perhaps kidnapped by pirates, or turned bandit himself out of dissatisfaction with his regent and aunt mother. Abbot Shatteraxe and other monks and nuns who had Lyucu roots sighed with relief at the news the invasion had not resulted in mass slaughter, but there was nothing they could do directly to alter the actions of ambitious thanes and elevated lords. They could only pray, meditate, heal each broken limb, mend each torn page, hope for the restoration of a more vigorous, fecund world. So I really appreciate that there's a mention that Thasseteki is making the lettering that he does look as much like dandelions as possible because it makes him feel close to her. That made a lot of sense to me. And it's also really interesting. I really think about this a lot, the idea of handwriting being linked so much to what a person is like, and the fact that we're really quickly entering an age where it's going to be less and less common for things to be handwritten, and how differently the approach to handwriting is likely to become due to that. And I don't mean like it will fall by the wayside entirely, because of course some things are always going to need to be handwritten. But there is almost like when things become sort of really antiquated to the point that it's very special when you do it, people sometimes start to take it even more seriously. So there were a lot of folks like lamenting how bad kids' handwriting was nowadays. One of those things where I'm just like, I'm not positive that's true, any more true than it has ever been. But I can't help but wonder now, is it going to become a thing where people really are paying special attention to that? I don't know. So this is when we get the Tale of Three Swords. And I'm going to summarize this there is a prince who is just watching men battle for fun. And he invites them to, do these fights in front of him. They die or get maimed, and he's having a great time, even though it's like kind of awful. And eventually this guy shows up, and he's real mysterious and doesn't look like a powerful sword fighter, but he's like talking a big game. And he says, "A man falls with each 10 steps I take, and I've walked 1,000 miles without anyone being able to stop me. I have 3 swords, the courage of brutes, the ambition of nobles, and the grace of kings." And the prince says, "Tell me about the courage of brutes," which really just betrays what his mindset is right now. "This is a sword forged from bronze, shaped by hammer and sharpened on stone. To wield it, one needs bulging muscles and a lust for blood. You can use it to lop off an opponent's head and spill his entrails on the ground. Fighting with it makes one no better than a beast bearing teeth and brandishing claws. In its wake are dozens of bodies and wasted potential." And then he describes the ambition of nobles, a sword forged from determination, shaped by cunning, sharpened on pride. To wield it, one needs the support of able strategists and the humility to listen to them. You can use it to conquer vast territories and humble your rivals. Fighting with it makes you one of the colossi, striding across the land in every age. In its wake are widows and orphans, cries of lamentation, and cycles of vengeance. And then, of course, the grace of kings. And by this point, the prince that he is talking to seems to be kind of like not feeling all of this the way that he was initially. "This is a sword forged from hope, shaped by experience, and sharpened on wisdom. To wield it, one must have a heart that can empathize with the meanest peasant as well as the proudest prince, to bear compassion for the loyal friend as well as the overweening foe. But one must also climb high enough and walk far enough to see beyond the here and now, to not be blinded by mere sentiment, to not mistake convention for truth. You can use it to defeat your enemies without fighting at all, and to realize the golden visions of ancient sages. Alone among the world's blades, it has no hilt, no grip, no handle. To grasp it, the wielder will bleed first. To unleash its power, you may be required to harm those you love, and to compromise with those you hate. You may be obligated to kneel before the conqueror and to sacrifice the innocent for a greater good. When you hold the grace of kings, a man will fall with every step you take, yet you may be compelled to march 1,000 miles without stopping to mourn. Does fighting with it leave you a name praised and honored down the ages? In its wake, are there celebrations, dances, songs, and poems, admiring children and devoted elders? No. No? No. How can you foretell the shadow you'll cast upon the future, when the future is a new river carving its own channel even as it flows? While the grace of kings will reshape the world, what it leaves in its wake cannot be predicted. If you fight with the grace of kings, you may leave behind a golden age that will in 10 generations' time swell into a tide of sorrow to overwhelm the world, or a wasteland of devastation upon which 10 springs after the winter a fresh, vibrant garden will sprout. If you wield it, be prepared to be remembered as a tyrant or a sage, a despot or a lawgiver, and perhaps all at once. To act even with the best of intentions may lead to an evil greater than that which was to be prevented. But to hesitate, even with the purest of designs, may lead to a proliferation of horrors worse than at first imagined. What is virtue today may one day be seen as vice. What is right today may one day be seen as wrong. It is folly to judge the rightness of an action solely by its consequences. For consequences beget consequences, and none can see to the end of all time, or tally up the accounts of all souls. And I really liked this because this is the sort of thing that's really like, I feel like a lot of us don't want to face the reality of this, that your intentions are kind of irrelevant in the face of what the effect is of what you do, and that the effect can change over time, and you really thought you were doing the right thing. And there's like so many ways, there's so many examples of this, you know, somebody raising their kid and really like wanting to do what's best for them, but not realizing that because they're being very strict, they're causing their kid to hide things from them. That leads to like schism between the two of them later on, even though they really thought at the time that they were doing what was best. Then there's laws where the intent behind a law can sometimes be like for the best in the one person's vision, but they did not think through the overall consequences to everyone else. And that is something that happens a lot, because frankly, a lot of lawmakers don't necessarily consider everybody who isn't the like target demographic that a law is meant to help. So it can have a lot of like lasting effects in other directions and be really damaging, even though that was not like the intent wasn't to cause this damage. There's just that it's a really messy, complicated thing. And I sort of like the idea of like, if you are going to wield this, you had better come to peace now with the fact that you don't get to control what your like legacy is, because to a degree, the more you try to control that, the messier it can get. And the prince is like, listen, I thought the whole point of this little like bit you were doing was that you were going to show me how the courage of brutes and ambition of nobles were the wrong way to go, but that I should wield the grace of kings instead, because my preoccupation with these guys like fighting and stuff was misguided and not productive or profitable. But I got to admit, this grace of kings sounds like it sucks, and I don't want anything to do with it. And Pidaji says, well, it's got more power than any other sword, but my master did used to say that maybe it should just be thrown into the ocean. And he's like, yeah, I can't say I disagree with that. And Pidaji says, we don't live in that world, though. So long as courage of brutes and ambition of nobles exist, the grace of kings will always be forged, and it will be wielded by the deserving and undeserving alike. Accept the necessity of doubt, but know also that you must end it before it ends you. Afterward, the prince dismissed all the swordsmen in his employ and drove them from his castle. And there's something about drove them from his castle. It's one thing to be like, all right, you know what? I guess I've had enough of this. You guys can take off. And another thing to be like, oh, get the fuck out. Get out. Go. Go. Like, I'm imagining him, like, hustling them, like, chasing them out, you know? And, yeah, I don't know. I really like this. So then we get commentary about this story afterwards. And the overall, like, what we get here is a conversation, like, an essay about the different ways that people have interpreted this story. Though King Meso died centuries ago, he remains a figure of some controversy. Some praise him for his lenient treatment of several peasant rebellions. Others argue that by negotiating a compromise, he dissipated the reformist sentiment among the nobility and allowed land ownership to grow even more imbalanced. Others denounce him for so depleting Matashi's treasury and weakening its army. How should history judge him? One's conclusion changes depending on one's perspective, just as the arguments of litigators before the magistrate shift based on who pays the bill. I will, free of charge, offer a few words on the Three Swords story itself. Many scholars have argued that this tale of a purported conversation between Pidgeotto and Meso was most likely a forgery decades after both had died. I will not opine on the strength of the evidence. I am more interested in what the story means. It will not surprise you to learn the tale's most avid debunkers are moralists. The point of the story is commonly understood to be a mockery of the moralist commitment to ancient rituals and classical modes of thought. Ushin Padaji claims the grace of kings can be used to realize the golden visions of ancient sages, a most succinct summary of moralist political philosophy, only to deflate it a few lines later by pointing out the unpredictable consequences of even the most idealistic reforms. Moralists throughout the ages have thus tried to counter this piece of Fluxist propaganda by elevating King Meso himself into an ideal moralist sovereign, emphasizing the positive consequences of his reign and burying the negative, in effect substituting one piece of historical fiction for another, which I do think is really funny. Like, that just feels so human to me, to be like, no, we can't have that because, it's just made up nonsense. So we're just going to make up stuff also to counter it. Like, why are we like this? And then he goes on to say, I don't think it's just this parable. It's like meant to be seen as practical and real. It's about human nature. And I suppose my lack of interest in whether they actually had this conversation will only prove that I am cynical, but I will indulge my wasteful habit of commenting upon the classics no more today. And somebody who has commented on that says, he has been roundly mocked by subsequent generations for his defense with the defense of the story as true-ish. The general charge is that he seemed to suggest the story was true because it was a good story. And I kind of of course I totally get why people would be like, dude, come on. But also I get what he means in terms of whether or not it really happened is just so beside the point. Like, who cares genuinely? And that's the sort of thing I always get stuck on. It's part of where I come down on a lot of stuff is just people will argue about a point that I'm like, yeah, but all of that aside, did you get anything useful out of the parable or the story? Like, it's meant to make you think and question your motives behind things and the way you see consequences and how much control you have over the world around you. And I just feel like that's the part that actually matters. So anyway, that's in summary, the story and the reactions to it. And then we go to Thase Teki, who is in the midst of transcribing this when he gets stopped by the abbot. And I was like, is this Dandelion? I almost wondered if we were getting teased a little bit and if we were going to be made to think it was her, but it wasn't. And then it turns out it is. And I was just like, oh, I'm so glad that these guys are reunited. So we find out some things here. Her brother had gone missing after the failed invasion, and rumors spread that her aunt mother was a tyrant who was willing to conspire with the Lyucu to secure her own place on the throne. Admiral Than Karukono, who had always loved her like an uncle, had died on the battlefield. Zomikidosu, who had cared for her like another sister, had disappeared from public view. Her secret attempts to contact Lady Soto had gone unanswered, and she dared not reach out to Aya Mazoti, her sister friend, lest she send the Farseers after her. And I was like, you guys, the fact that Phyro had disappeared and not been heard from again, I have got to be honest, it seems like he is indeed raising an army to go up against Gia, like they were saying in a later chapter. But I had been so sure from the way he was talking that he wasn't going to do that, that I don't know what to think of this now. Like, I almost wondered if he went to Gia and she had imprisoned him, or I don't even know what. Like, I really sort of thought his disappearance was down to her in some way. And it seems like that's not it at all. And I'm really going to be bummed if he took the bait. I just wanted so much for him to be better than she expected. And I took it at like face value, the interpretation of what he said. And I can't even remember exactly what it was, but it was something that seemed to be like, we can't just be doing these cycles over and over again. And I have to put an end to this, which I thought meant I'm not going to like exert vengeance or exact vengeance upon her, because it's just around and around we go. But now I'm feeling like I must have misunderstood what he meant. So let's see. So we get some tales about how Phyro was like going around trying to find him. And then she realizes like Lady Soto was right about not actually trying to find him. She is trying to understand herself. And we find out about like the pressures of growing up under the House of Dandelion and her father's reputation, even though he is a man that she like really didn't know at all. And all of the things that people thought she would be versus what she actually wants. And eventually she realizes that she is an ordinary person. She doesn't have like any particularly outstanding gift. Even as an artist, she's sort of average, but it doesn't matter. Like, just being average, she still deserves to be happy. And that being around the people at the Splendid Urn was a time in her life where she felt truly seen. And I feel like the term of like, oh, I feel so seen has been used a lot in a joking way, so that people don't really take that phrasing very seriously anymore. But I really feel like it's something I've only started to appreciate over the past few years, how truly important it is to feel like somebody can tell who you really are. Because it's a tricky thing where some of us, like, we consciously attempt to keep people from knowing us because we are afraid that if they do know who we are, they won't like us. Or if they know the worst parts of us, they'll judge us for it. So there's that aspect of just like, you want people to like you despite all your flaws, but you also don't show your flaws. And so how can you ever be proven wrong if you never open yourself up and be vulnerable? And then there's like just an aspect of, even if somebody doesn't agree with what it is that you are aiming for or stand for or love, if they get it, that's still more than other people in your life may have got, like more than they may know about you. And the being seen thing, it's something that I don't think that I had truly understood. When I was younger, there was a meme I saw recently, and I talked about this on an episode of the book club that I will be putting out soon that I did with the Overdue Boys. We covered a book called Cackle. And it is a book that can be kind of frustrating because the main character is going through this bad breakup. And she is longing desperately for her ex-boyfriend and idealizes him in a way that we often do after we're dumped, and just wants to go back to how things were, despite kind of having like a pretty cool setup in her new life. She's not appreciating it. And the meme that I had seen recently was if I could give young women any advice, it would be to completely disregard the opinions of men and not to pursue men at all. I cannot emphasize enough how much time you will save, how much energy you will conserve, and how much better your life will be if you don't waste time trying to get the approval of men. It is a pointless exercise because it is not worth anything. And you will get it thinking this will make you feel something. And you'll never really feel validated because it's not actually worthwhile. That's not real. It's not love, even though it can be mistaken for it. It's not real affection. It's not them actually seeing you. It's you trying to gain a sort of validation that is so utterly external and so fleeting and so dependent on the whims of other people that it's almost not about you. And I felt like I had been flicked between the eyes because I suddenly realized how much of my life I have wasted simply seeking the approval of men. Everything growing up, everything that I was shown about how to be a successful woman in terms of being somebody to be envied came down to, men want her, women want to be her kind of thing. And that was always about appearance. It was always about the way that I presented myself and how many men lusted after me or how many men fell for me or whatever. And in searching for that validation, I hid who I actually was in favor of what I thought would play the best, and quickly discovered it's very easy, actually, to get approval from men. It's so easy that it feels like it's almost insulting to them. And yet, I indeed was not feeling the way I thought I should feel. And my relationships would sort of fall apart after that initial courting phase because I was presenting a face that I was not interested in maintaining for the rest of my life. I only put this face up in order to get this immediate approval. So when they decided to throw in with me and be in a relationship for longer than that, and that part of who I was began to fall away so they could see who I actually was, it was a bit of a shock to them, and to me even sometimes. So I feel like now I'm 38, I'm turning 39 in just a few days. I am only just really getting who I am. And I wish so much that the dialogue that is so common today about putting yourself first was something that had been more a part of my life when I was younger so that I understood. Because being seen, it involves putting yourself out there and being genuine and not trying to get something out of people. And this is also, I think, part of why I didn't have close friends, because I prioritized relationships with men over friendships, which of course resulted in friends falling by the wayside because I just didn't consider them as important. And being seen now as a grown woman has begun to happen because I have real friendships with women who I actually open up to and talk to. And so anyway, all of this her soul searching and everything, I really, really felt this. And I can't help but be she is lucky that she is figuring this out so early in life, because I'm just going through this now. I'm going to be 40 in not very long. And I grew up in a more enlightened age than a lot of women older than me who have only grown to know who they are, even later in life than I have. And just, it doesn't have to be like this. But the way that we have set women specifically up for failure in this way, especially when it's about male approval, and beauty fades. It just does. So when everything about your identity hinges on something that is so transient, it's inevitable that you will reach a point where it feels like you don't know what your identity is anymore, because it had been so centered around appearance, which is no longer something you can rely on. So anyway, this, she's realizing like her affection for him is it's so tied in with being seen. And she departed the pomp and intrigue of the court and traveled around Dara. She was not the cleverest student nor the most skilled artist, but she was confident about which poems were worthy of being memorized and which weren't. She loved music and painting. And she thinks back on the 4 great pleasures: sitting by a cozy fire in winter, climbing a high place after spring rain, eating fresh crabs with brewed tea in the fall, and dipping your feet into a cool lotus-covered lake in summer. And she had mentioned, you didn't mention the love of a handsome man. Each of the pleasures I mentioned is better with a friend. A real friend is a mirror that reflects the truth back to us. So eventually she stumbles across a scroll that is in her handwriting. And it's the first clue that she has, like, hold on, wait, am I getting closer? So this is how she finds him. And she stays at the temple for several days. And it's just like, I really was sort of wondering how this was going to go. What it turns into is first Kinri trying to ask her to stay. And she thinks, like, become a nun and move into the convent. And he's like, no. We find out a little bit later that chastity is part of, like, the deal with being here. But he's thinking, like, at least you could live up in this part of the world and we can hide. And he doesn't say the word hide, but that's what he means. And this is when Abbot Shattered Axe shows up and is like, hey, bro, it's time for you to go. And Kinri initially is just like, what? No. And I say Kinri, the name that is being used here is Savo, so I probably should just move back to Savo. And when he's like, I want to mend the world, the abbot's like, yeah, there's a lot of ways to do that. And you don't have to stand apart from everything. In fact, you really shouldn't. And he says, I can't choose between Dara and Lyucu. Then don't choose. Whenever there seem to be only 2 impossible choices, you must find a third path. So they go back to the splendid urn, and Widow Wasu gathers them up and whisks them away, and she winds up with her brother. And I'm really like, what is it? What is it that he's doing, though? Like, what is it that he's doing? I don't know what to think. So then we go to 37. Thirst. And Gia is with one of her, I don't know if it's one of the twins or what, but Wee and Shido, that's right. So it's these 2 that are pretending to be the pirate queens or whatever. They are basically covering their tracks regarding everything with the berries. And let's see. Tifan Huto was thirsty. He had never been so thirsty in his life. And he is just going through horrific withdrawals. It turns out, I had forgotten about how they lie to him that they have implanted these like weird mushrooms in his body. So he is putting down his symptoms to the mushrooms, like tearing up his insides. And eventually, when he stumbles across some more berries on the floor, he just eats them because he's like, well, they made me feel so amazing that if I'm going to die from these fucking mushrooms, I may as well die high as a kite. So he eats them and feels amazing for a little bit. And there's this moment, guys. The bandit queens had said there was no way to be free of the mushroom unless his viscera were removed with it. We'll see about that, won't we? I'll be my own doctor. And then we jump right to a funeral. Supposedly the body didn't even get to lie in the mourning hall for a full week, as was custom. Years later, long after the Huto clan had faded into obscurity, if one were to ply an old mortician with plenty of drink and silver, he might sometimes break the vows of his profession and describe for bar patrons the most terrifying corpse he had ever prepared for burial. And everybody has tried to guess how this guy died. He had done it with his own fingers. He had scratched and clawed at his throat until he had torn away most of his neck. I cannot imagine his state of mind. Tazu must have been in his head, which is truly so horrifying. The idea of him just I'm thinking he's going to cut himself open somehow, which is quite bad enough. But somehow doing this with his bare hands is so much worse. Oh my God. Anyway, so this is when we go to chapter 38 and we have a conversation between these two soldiers. And this was really interesting. The thing that's happening here is we have a boy named Asulu. He's only 18 years old. And there is a soldier named Egi who is in his 40s. And Asulu is a young idealist who thinks things are exactly what they look like. And Egi is somebody who understands that things aren't what they look like, but also has these pretty wild conspiracy theories. And it's an interesting conversation because, to a point, the conspiracy theories that he comes up with, you can understand where he's coming from on this. He's talking about Phyro disappearing, and he says, do you really believe on the way home from Rui, the emperor decided to take a skiff out to fish away from the fleet? And he says something like, only children and fools would believe that preposterous story. So he starts off immediately insulting Asulu for believing this thing. And it sort of continues on like this with him berating this kid to a point about buying the lines that he's fed. And it's really reminding me of and this is such a weird thing. It's not a direct comparison, but it makes me think of people who believe in a lot of government conspiracy theories, where I definitely think that the government is systemically oppressing us. But the reasons why, for me, are very different than a lot of the conspiracy theorists out there who imagine a sort of organized cabal, whereas I think, well, no, it doesn't have to be that. It's what it looks like because they don't even try to hide it. It's systemic racism and misogyny and ableism. It's all the same shit it's always been. But some people want there to be something more specific, because how do you fight systemic racism and sexism? And, that's not fun to talk about. It's depressing. So you create a boogeyman, and that's a lot more interesting. This isn't exactly that, because it's not like he has completely invented a whole other interior system that's going on, but he is coming up with the most lurid explanations for everything. So I don't want to use up all my time on this, but suffice to say, what Asulu is the one who is just going, I want to do what's right for Dara. And Egi is yeah, but what you think is the right thing for Dara isn't what the rulers are actually interested in. They are using you and telling you it's the right thing for Dara so that you will obey them, but that's not what they actually give a shit about. And it's kind of like a back and forth about this that ends up with Eggie saying, well, what it comes down to is it doesn't matter who is ruling. All that matters is that we are doing better than we ever have, like in a long time. We have fields that are fertile and giving us good crops. We have people getting married and having children. We have trade that is flourishing. All of this, for me, points to the fact that something Gia's doing is correct. She's managing it somehow. So even if she is full of shit about a lot of things, even if she is a despot that's like, you know, shoving aside her stepsons so that she can have power, I can't really be that mad about it because we are really doing okay under her rulership, and I don't give that much of a shit about anything else, which I really do understand. And I can't help, like, this is the exact sort of premise of like Song of Ice and Fire, where peasants don't care who sits the Iron Throne. All they want is healthy children and a bountiful harvest and a fireside to be safe at. Who sits on the throne is fucking irrelevant for them. Everybody else who's higher up gives a shit. But we have very basic things that we need to be concerned with from day to day because our needs won't be met if shit goes left. And as long as those are met, do a fucking whatever. I don't care. Let's see. It was all a sham manufactured by the Empress and her cabal after they got rid of Thera, probably because the princess refused to be her mother's willing puppet. So the whole thing with like Thera marrying this, you know, prince who is from the Aegon and going through the Wall of Storms, he thinks that all is complete bullshit and that she just wants to, Gia just wants to like set Thera aside so that she can have power. So he believes that she straight up murdered Thera. And this was so funny, you guys, this line. You and I eat something and poop it straight out the day after. But the intestines of people who crave real power have 81 coils, so they can really let the shit ferment into cunning plots. And I was like, that is a wild way to say that. Okay, sir. And then he talks about how like Gia is in on things with Tom Vanaki, and that probably Gia has like decided to let Phyro go to war to show Tom Vanaki that they have teeth. Let's see. She engineered the death of Grand Princess Thera, maintained the peace with Lyucu, and refused to step aside as regent. The peace treaty with the Lyucu is a smokescreen for a secret understanding between the Empress and Tom Vanaki to help each other stay in power. The Garinnifins are bargaining chips, and the Emperor's failed invasion is really just the manifestation of a family power struggle. And the Emperor wasn't invading unredeemed Dara out of concern for the people. They are both just fighting each other for more power. The one thing that matters to them ultimately is power. If you're right, then we're expected to fight against the Emperor himself. That would be treason. Eggie eyed him and chuckled. I'm sure you're not the only one bothered by the thought. That's why the Empress doesn't openly say the Emperor is rebelling against her. Bandits and Lyucu spies make a convenient excuse. I don't give a sheep's fart. The Empress is the regent, and I've got no problem with fighting for her against anyone. And I just thought that was like a really practical, even though, you know, I think his ideas in general are quite wrong. Overall, the attitude he has here makes a lot of sense to me. And he talks about also, like, what do you think would happen about, like, if we were to win this and if we were to free Rui and Dasu, think about how much it would cost to, like, get those islands back into shape and feed all of those people. Everything that it would take, writing it off is the way to go. Then we don't have to worry about cleaning up that mess. And Asulu is like, wait a minute, really? And he doesn't know what to think, because it seems like what this guy is saying makes sense, but he also feels like really ashamed of the fact that he can understand it, and also ashamed of being used this way. Most people, especially those who own a little property, think like this. You're still young and foolish. When you're older and wiser, you won't be so contemptuous of a piece that you find objectionable. Whatever her faults and schemes, Empress Gia has done well for all of us. And he talks about how his daughters are getting educated, learning how to read and write. And he's, despite saying, like, you know, we can't trust these assholes, is trying to get up into those echelons, you know. Did you see me sign my name in front of the paymaster last week? Her tutor tells me she's got a gift. If she keeps up her hard work, I'll pay to send her to an academy and have her take the examination. Can you imagine me, the father of a Toko Dawiji? And I was just laughing because, like, at this point, you know, as much as he's like, these people are so full of shit, they don't care, but still wants to be part of it, which is so real, you know, like, come on, this is so real. Doesn't everyone you know live better now than they did 10 years ago? That's true, confessed Asulu. I don't know if I'd give her credit for everything. She doesn't do much. All I hear is how she enjoys picking handsome young men. And they make a joke about him maybe being picked eventually. A loud boom outside the watchtower, not quite like thunder. The two guards peered out and were astonished to see a firework explosion in the western sky. It was bright, golden, and the streaks persisted despite the rain. A gigantic booming dandelion. A second boom, then a third. And they see airships. It says hulking shadows, airships. Yes, they had to be airships. And I'm like, do they? Because I don't know about this. It fits with what they think is happening, but I don't want to believe it. I just don't want to. So then we go to 39, Madness. And we are with Goztan Ryoto, who, as it turns out, despite having been, what's the word I want? Disgraced. Once shit goes as left as it goes, she gets pulled from the dugout, and it's just it's a desperate move that I was really hoping would result in the end with Kutan Rovo being killed. I wanted Tanvanaki to execute Kutan Rovo so bad. And honestly, I felt like things at the moment are so disrupted and chaotic that Kutan Rovo dying now would be a reasonable thing to cover up. She has been so worried about how many people were behind Kutan Rovo that she didn't want to, like, it felt like Kutan Rovo had so much power, but I would argue that the power she had was over people who were suffering from this withdrawal, and maybe now is the time to take this bitch out so that you do not have to deal with her anymore. So I was sort of low-key waiting for that this chapter. And when it turns out that Kutan Rovo had been like hiding some information about how the berries aren't as potent, I thought that might be what drove Tanvanaki over the edge. But no, she doesn't. Kutan Rovo is still alive by the end of this section, and I was pissed off. So, and also she's not even suffering from the fucking madness, because she has a secret stash that she's been using to, like, get herself through. So I'm not even getting the, like, satisfaction of her suffering with this thing. it's certainly got an expiration date on it, because that stash will eventually, disappear. But I did not get the satisfaction I wanted. And I'm certain Kutanrovo will end up dead. But every time she participates in these conversations, it kills my heart a little bit. And I don't want any more of it. I hate it. I hate her so much. I can't even think of like an adequate punishment for somebody who has done the things that she has done. There's nothing even close to adequate. So Gostan is walking in amongst the rubble of Creefy. And it says all she could hear was a faint chorus of desperate groans and dream-fervent mutterings. The pleas of hundreds of Lyucu warriors for their thirst to be slaked, for their hunger to be satisfied, for the burning lava coursing through their veins to be cooled by a soothing ambrosia they no longer had access to. And she's like, how in the hell did this all happen? This place is totaled. And it turns out that there was a fight. This guy explains to her, one of the kulaks saw her companion sneak out of camp, and she suspected that he was hoarding Toliusa. She followed him out, and when she saw him duck down behind a broken wall without coming back up, she thought he was consuming the berries in secret. She gathered a few other kulaks from the same camp and attacked him. And Gostan is like, but how did the fight become fatal? I was supposed to confiscate all the weapons, and so, like, she shouldn't have had anything. The Narovotan looked revolted, but forced himself to go on. She bit him in the throat, thinking that she could get some of the potency of the Toliusa from his blood. And I cannot, like, it's one thing to bite simply because you're in the midst of a fight. If I were ever to be attacked, you had better believe biting is going to be a big part of my strategy. I have a very strong jaw, strong enough that my dentist even commented on it at one point when he asked me to bite down on something. I think that I could do some real damage. But when you are biting because you are trying to get at something in a person's throat, that's just so, like, I don't even know what kind of word to use there. The animalistic nature of it, it's not even really adequate, because animals, I don't think they would even do this. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. So apparently Kutanrovo said that nobody could have any more Toliusa for, it was 3 weeks ago, except for the shamans in religious rituals. And everybody was sort of like, that's weird, because she was the one who was telling everybody to have as much as they wanted. At first, the consequences were unremarkable. Some warriors became irritable, and incidents of brawling and feuds increased. Thinking it was merely a case of spoiled Naros fuming over being denied a luxury, the Thanes lectured the instigators severely and increased the punishment for those who fought privately. Among the tribes, it was not unheard of for warriors to occasionally fall prey to a kind of mad craving for Kyofir and Toliusa, but such incidents were rare and generally viewed as a manifestation of weakness, which is certainly something that everybody still thinks about addiction today. The sufferers were usually ostracized and denied the craved good until they recovered on their own, or, if they were powerful, simply given enough of it to function. Toliusa madness had never been a big problem. But eventually, a week later, they are in crisis mode. Creefy was virtually paralyzed. The afflicted spent most of their time mired in a spiritless torpor with no appetite or drive, unable to rouse themselves, and once in a while, as though possessed by some demonic energy, they would lash out violently and need to be subdued before sinking back into that listless languor. And it says, worst off were the children. Some mere babes had been born with the madness in them. I was just, that part, anytime that it's like somebody who absolutely has no choice in being involved is suffering, that's where I have the hardest time. And that's with infants, that's with animals. It's just like, there's something about at least knowing why you're suffering that gives me a little bit of comfort, but something happening and not having any context or reason, that's so much worse to me. And I don't think that's like rational necessarily, but you know, Kutan Rovo finally had to reveal the reasons behind her recent about face. She had been trading with the pirates. Kutan Rovo was quick to point out that Peku herself had set the precedent, and among the goods she obtained were supplies of wild Lyucu. And Tamvanaki, I really do kind of appreciate how real Tamvanaki is with herself about all of how this shook out. And the fact that, like, as much as she wants to blame Kutan Rovo exclusively, she has to acknowledge that she turned a blind eye to something that was like actually sort of suspicious. The battle dances had been so frenzied and the chanting so thunderous, Tamvanaki felt her warriors loving her more than they had loved her father. Considering how many of the projects for making Ukyu Ta'asa to be more like Ukyu had failed, the spirit rallies were one of the few bright points in her increasingly dreary life. And it says that she's like, you know, she's taking the drugs sometimes and then like sleeping with a bunch of guys. She isn't allowing Timu at her sleeping mat at all anymore. She should have known the sparse patches on the lava flow in Rui and Dasu could not possibly have supplied enough berries to support Kutan Rovo's largesse. She had willfully refused to ask Kutan Rovo questions because she had been afraid she wouldn't like the answers, and she didn't want her one pleasure taken away. And that, for me, is the real clincher there. When everything is bad, when you are having like a sort of a general crisis, there being one little thing that keeps you going, you like, you know, this is something I think a lot of us are starting to really grasp regarding the way that we live now. With capitalism just going into hyper mode, so many of us have been willing to accept the absolute bare minimum of like, yeah, I barely have enough money to make rent. I'm certainly not making enough to put away any for savings. I can't afford or barely can afford health insurance, but at least I can still have like my nice coffee. At least I can still watch whatever I want on Netflix. It's just these little things that like give us enough to turn a blind eye to the fact that in general, our lives are not sustainable. We are headed toward a crisis because we are going to reach an age where we can no longer work and we have nothing to live on. But we don't want to look at that because it's too overwhelmingly terrible. So we give ourselves small, immediate comforts. And there's no, like, I'm not criticizing that. It's 100% what I do also. This is how you have to like get through, but it's a distraction from the major problem. So anyway, I'm way over time, so I really have got to like wrap this up, but we have the big conversation where Kutan Rovo admits that even though they tried to plant the berries, they won't sprout. And eventually it's Ghostan who's like, these guys know how to cultivate. And I think that these berries were made to be more potent, were made to be sterile, And it turns out that there's like a blight on the ones that they were able to grow, which I don't know if that was also orchestrated, but I have to assume it was. And Kutan Rovo is so angry at Ghostan for suggesting that anybody could, like, you know, engineer these berries. She's such an idiot. Like, she just doesn't want to see what's right in front of her fucking face. And Ghostan eventually is sent to get some of the berries that are fertile and try and cultivate those. And she has to, like, double bathe so that she doesn't bring the blight with her to the supply that is untouched for right now. So there's also a really, like, terrible scene where Tamvanaki is beating the hell out of Timu because she had found a scroll that he was trying to send where she says, "You would invite your mother's army to come and slaughter my people." And he says, "I was not plotting against the interests of our people. I only wrote to ask for another shipment of food and clothing." And Tamvanaki says, "It's code. I know how your devious mind works. Everything is buried under layer after layer of illusions and word games. You're trying to tell Gia we're weak, trying to invite her to invade." And he says, "But we are weak." And she's like, "There have been no reports of food shortages. We have put down roots in Ukyuta-asa. And once we've got a domestic supply of Toliusa, we will be fine again." And he says, "Are you serious? You have, like, are you at all looking at the reality of the situation?" And let's see, the great tent was otherwise deserted. "You knew?" Tanvanaki roared. Kutanrova inclined her head defiantly. "I had long heard sporadic reports that the Toliusa we find in the military reserve lava flows lacks the potency of the wild Toliusa obtained from the pirates." So just a sort of weird, like, back and forth here. But, and by back and forth, I mean, like, going into a flashback of that conversation and then back to Kutanrovo. But the chapter ends with Ghostan getting into that, getting onto that ship. "Keep the natives fed." Tamvanaki gave Kutanrovo a hard glare. "With so many of our warriors laid low by the madness, we cannot afford any uprisings. Do you understand?" And that is the end of the chapter. The next one is called The Battle of Pond Part 1, which is what makes me think that Phyro is indeed going to battle, and I don't like it. Anyway, Ms. T is in the chat. "I'm so glad 40 is doing that for you. I can't wait for you to see 50. It's 40, but even better." I have heard that, yeah. So hopefully, you know, women, we get tricked. It's a lot of trickery happening for us, and we have to figure shit out. So anyway, thank you guys again so much for hanging out and for listening. Thank you, Kyle, for commissioning this. Hoping that you're enjoying the coverage. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.